Hello. Hi there. Short lesson today. We've talked about publics, species of rhetoric, proofs, rhetorical situations, social imaginaries, forms, genres, constellations, interpolation, and kairos, among other things. And today we're going to talk about the public sphere, an idea we explored when we looked at Charles Taylor, but this requires closer examination. Enter Mr. James Jasinski. Jasinski is a rhetorician in Washington, working at both UW and the Common Studies Department of the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. His sourcebook on rhetoric addresses a number of ideas concerning rhetorical concepts and key thoughts, and it's a great guide for people looking to dive into the deep end of rhetorical analysis. You probably have access to it through an online portal, and I recommend it. In this short article, Jasinski talks about the public sphere. In keeping with the nature of the class, we need to answer the question, why look at this first? The answer is fairly simple and direct. Comprehending the public sphere means analyzing not only occurrences, but also relationships. And if you're going to talk about relationships, then why not look at the role of the press and the public, among other things? That's a key element of what Habermas's version of the public sphere entails, which he wrote about in his now classic text, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, in 1962. So we're looking at Habermas through Jasinski today. Let's analyze Jasinski's article. Habermas tells the story of the public sphere as a story, looking at the structural transformation of the European public sphere, talking about its emergence in Europe and the way it, quote, functioned to mediate between the state, most specifically the executive power of a nation, and society, private economic activity, and then goes on to analyze its degradation and its transformation in the 20th century. It's essentially a chronicle of social transformation, and as Jasinski notes, it had resonance with what was happening in the late 1960s, when younger Germans were experiencing a lot of upset and confusion in their lives. And you'll remember, this is when you had a separate East and West Germany, since this was all happening during the Cold War. Jasinski offers his take on the question of why we should study this, saying, quote, rhetorical practice always is situated. It regularly comes into existence in certain physical places or settings. See also the entry for argument field. For Jasinski, the place of the public sphere as it relates to discourse and deliberation is important. He says, quote, given the mutually reinforcing relationship between rhetorical practice and the public sphere, the attention devoted to the concept by rhetorical scholars should not be surprising. More importantly, a lot of the rhetorical studies we see today are influenced by this idea. Jasinski brings up an important thing we should remember. The public sphere is real and also ideal. These are two sides of the concept which are in tension. Jasinski also calls these the descriptive, for the real, and the normative, for the ideal. Working in the descriptive mode, a public sphere looks at real-life conditions on the political and social levels that enable and constrain public discourse in society. Here's where the roles of institutions, practices, and normal behaviors can be found at work and manifested in places, like a public area such as a modern-day agora, or a market, or in groups like political organizations, or in media or the news. In addition to these, the public sphere contains legal rights, constraints, although not necessarily in Bitzer's sense, and prohibitions. It also includes cultural values and traditions that feed into a culture's common sense, or social knowledge. But as a normative concept, or an ideal concept, remember they're the same, the public sphere looks for norms and ideals that continue over time, which, while not fully realized in a particular sphere, can work as a grounding for social critique. And this is where we see Toulmin back in the mix, because we're looking at how a liberal public sphere in Europe, quote, revealed the possibility that rational critical discourse could function as a way of testing claims to the general or national interest. Claims that could not withstand the political scrutiny or publicity of the public sphere would necessarily be withdrawn. Crucially, this is where you could spot failures in systems. Speaking on universal access and how it was often denied to groups and people who should ideally have a place in the public sphere, Jasinski points out the following. Doesn't the contradiction between ideal and practice invalidate the entire concept of the bourgeois public sphere? Habermas's answer was no. The principle of universal access to the public sphere still can have a normative function. It can be deployed in social and political critique, despite its only partial realization in the historical practices that constituted the bourgeois public sphere. In other words, even if things aren't ideal, and people are being discriminated against or denied a place at the table, you can still use the idea of universal access to critique things, even if the reality of the situation is not always one size fits all. Please remember that. It's something you can see animating and fueling a lot of arguments. You could perhaps see a similar logic at work in the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. Jasinski talks about the first half and the second half of the book as well, and he talks about the power of public debate and opinion in the public sphere in the first half. Critical argument had political weight and influence, and if that's not a rhetorical concept, then what is? In the second half, Habermas looks at the decline of the bourgeois public sphere, tracing structural, cultural, and historical shifts, and specifically looks at the impact of consumption and market forces. These could have grave effects on critical reflection processes, especially when we're looking at politicians like we'd look at types of food or different types of bubblegum. Jasinski then goes on to talk about how the idea of the public sphere was taken up by a number of notable rhetorical scholars, like Hauser, Goodnight, Taylor, and citing himself, Jasinski. He also talks about people who found faults or issues with the idea, such as Calhoun. He's also talking about the value of this idea in terms of how it can be used in relation to practical reason. Grasping the public sphere is an idea where situated practice is happening every day in our lives, while the perfect model of ideal practical reason is somewhere out there too, is important because it can help you craft better arguments to address the here and now. You can see what's going on, trace the biases of their preferences, understand the role of institutional power, and the imbalances you're going to deal with, and make better, more informed, and more direct critiques, which can have an impact on your own lives and that of others. And so that's the lesson for today, and start thinking about these concepts as you prepare your next paper. See you online.